And so I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our two workshop leaders, and we'll go ahead and get started. So Ruchita Gaudu is a sophomore at Duke University interested in diving deeper into topics of environmental justice and situating communities of color within the climate crisis and environmental activism. She's involved with the Duke Climate Coalition and also helped organize Duke's Environmental Justice House course this past fall. And Maya Ganem is a sophomore at Duke University who aspires to address the impacts of climate change and air pollution on health outcomes in marginalized communities. On Duke's campus, Maya conducts research with Dr. Weinthal and Dr. Sowers on the impacts of energy infrastructure on human health in the Middle East and North Africa region. She's also the Justice Coordinator of the Undergraduate Environmental Union. And with that, Maya and Rashida, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out, and we're glad that you're here. So we're just going to talk for maybe 20 to 30 minutes, hopefully, and then we can split into breakout rooms afterwards. I don't see, is Rachita here? Oh, wait, there she, okay. Sorry, the Zoom is kind of being weird. But yeah. So I think we should just start with the let me present, sorry. Okay. So we were gonna do an icebreaker, but I think there's too many people. So we'll skip that. So let's just start with the definition of environmental justice. There are two important components. One, we want to make sure that everyone has the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards. And two, we want everyone to have equal access to the decision-making process, to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. So this was primarily started by people of color who experience a lot of inequity in terms of environmental protection in their communities. So a lot of pollution or, other environmental hazards were focused on these low-income BIPOC communities, and they sought to address that. So it's important to note that social justice issues and environmental issues are very intertwined in this concept of environmental justice. The concept of environmental justice took off during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and North Carolina. Okay. North Carolina is actually a pretty big hub, I guess, for environmental justice. A lot of the movements started in our state. And also, I want to note that, mainstream environmentalism is considered to be pretty white and elite. It's definitely dominated by a white elite class. And so the idea of environmental justice is to incorporate more perspectives and to increase diversity in terms of approaching environmental issues.
Yeah, so just sort of this is three sort of main topics that we chose to focus on within North Carolina. This is a lot of words, so I'll hopefully try to break it down a little bit. So Warren County is sort of thought to be one of the founding places for the environmental justice movement. Basically what happened is that in this county that is primarily African American, primarily consisting of communities of color. It was in the 1980s, I think, that state governments basically allowed more than 6,000 truckloads of PCBs to be dumped in a landfill in one of the smaller cities within this county. So there was a lot of risk, if not actual causation of water pollution and just sort of soil contamination and things like that. And again, sort of as Maya said, and this is something that we will sort of reiterate over and over again, is that the whole idea of environmental injustices is that they disproportionately impact communities of color and already sort of vulnerable populations. And that's not just sort of an environmental justice sort of thing. That's sort of a, when you look at environmental issues in general, they will almost always disproportionately impact already vulnerable populations. So that happened in North Carolina, which is not cool, but it's very interesting to see that so many sort of, as Maya said, a lot of like birthplaces or a lot of like movements have started within sort of the American South in terms of American environmental justice. So our second sort of topic is pipelines. So I'm sure you all sort of kept up with the news of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline this past summer. It was a 600-mile long pipeline that would carry natural gas basically along the entire eastern United States, ending in Robeson County. So although sort of supporters of the pipeline might say that they are relatively safe and that they're sort of quote unquote like trying to fight for green or sort of more, I guess, sustainable forms of energy, we do see that natural gas is not good for the environment. It's not good for the populations that sort of have to live near these pipelines. So on July 5th of 2020, so this past summer, after a lot of sort of struggles and protests from Native American communities, environmental groups, and legislators sort of in tandem, we see that Dominion Duke Energy ended up canceling it. And sort of an important point to note is that just sort of the construction of the pipeline, even if the pipeline itself wouldn't have been harmful to the environment, to the people, the construction of it would have caused a lot of sort of damage to sort of soil and waterways, and also sort of just like significant cultural areas within sort of Robeson County and beyond. And sort of third one is hog farming / biogas, which again is something that is definitely like something that has been talked about for many years, but is still a hot topic in terms of North Carolinian like folks and communities. So basically, hog farming is very big here. There's almost 9 million hogs on more than 2,400 farms, primarily located in eastern North Carolina. And so decades of studies and research have shown that hog farms have health impacts, but also sort of just like decrease the quality of life within these areas. Something that is important to note, but also isn't necessarily a coincidence, is that a lot of these communities near hog farms are disproportionately low income and communities of color. Also something sort of that's like, I know in the news every once in a while is that Duke Energy is like invested in biogas, and every once in a while there will be sort of an advancement or delay in terms of how they invest their money in this. And so biogas basically is this idea that we can convert hog waste into so-called renewable or clean energy. Sorry, an important point to note is that it basically increases the demand for hog waste. So if you're using hog waste to create clean energy, you need more hog waste to continue making that source of energy. So yeah, those are just sort of big overview things. Yeah. And we also wanted to highlight sort of important activists within North Carolina, but also in general. So these are three that we sort of like came up with. So Naima Mohammed works with the NC Environmental Justice Network, specifically like working towards reducing and ending hog farming within North Carolina. Yeah, she's incredible. And then Catherine Coleman Flowers is an environmental health researcher and now a MacArthur Fellow, I think is what it is. Maybe I mispronounced that or missaid that. But she has written a book about sort of water contamination and sort of the water sort of inequities that we see across the American South. And Dr. Robert Bullard is known as sort of this father of environmental justice. He sort of does a ton of research and has been doing a ton of research for decades on environmental racism within the American South, and is now a professor at the Texas Southern University. Naima Mohammed and Catherine Coleman Flowers, we were fortunate enough to have them at Duke this past fall semester, and there are webinars that you should be able to find online, but we will also link those in the chat. So we wanted to do sort of 4 like case studies on Indigenous rights and environmental justice, because I know that's sort of the focus of this track. And yeah, and we will get into those as we go into the next slides. So sort of the first one is public land conservation in the United States. Something that isn't really well known about environmentalism is it has quite a racist and white supremacist history. A lot of early conservationists, such as Madison Grant, Theodore Roosevelt, John Muir, who started the Sierra Club, the environmental organization, sort of actively held white supremacist and anti-Native sentiments, and sort of how this is seen is this establishment of national parks and so-called public lands. Sort of maybe we might see it as unintentional, but I think at the time it was very much so a show of power. Did mean that Native Americans who had lived on these lands for hundreds of years were displaced and sort of forced to move out in the name of sort of protection and conservation. And that sort of leads me to our next point, that a lot of the times ideas of protection and conservation of land sort of mean that land has to be sort of this like pristine, like wildlife that is like untouched by humans, and like humans are sort of this like this entity that like dirties or like pollutes land, when although that is sort of something that we have seen in the past 2 years really being exacerbated, we know that there are instances, and there were hundreds of years of sort of indigenous folks who lived on lands very sort of equitably and very sustainably. And so I think there needs to be this sort of understanding that in order to sort of move towards a sustainable future, that we need to understand how to best live within the land rather than sort of separate from it.
So another example has to do with the wildfires in California that have been getting pretty bad within the past few years. So a lot of native tribes in California have this ancient practice of having controlled burns, and through that it's kind of reshaping the nature and the landscape so that, you know, plants can grow healthily. And that's a practice that a lot of native tribes have to, you know, live with nature. And this has always been a part of California's landscapes, but when, you know, when the lands were colonized, a lot of tribes were prohibited from holding these controlled burns that would clear out the underbrush. And as a result, there's been kind of a buildup within California, and a lot of the fires that we've seen lately are a result of, you know, the land is not, you know, the underbrush isn't cleared anymore, so we're getting a lot of fires, and we're seeing the results of that. So I found this quote from Bill Tripp, a member of the Karuk tribe. He said that in recent decades, our area has been plagued by large fires, including the Big Bar Complex Fire in 1999, the Backbone Complex Fire in 2009, and the Butler Fire in 2013. Time and time again, we find ourselves dropping everything to respond to fire suppression activities while trying to keep up the fight to revitalize our Indigenous responsibility as we witness our culture being destroyed. So clearly there's, you know, native tribes aren't allowed to have these controlled fires, and then their areas and where they live are being very targeted by these fires. Lately, within the past year, a lot of government officials are starting to be more open to the idea of holding these controlled fires. They're quoting it as this idea of bringing back good fire. And I live in California, so there were a lot of articles, you know, on NPR or on The Atlantic that were talking about this idea of government officials working with native tribes. And they're like, oh, we found the solution. And then a lot of my Indigenous friends were like, really? You found the solution? So it's kind of interesting to see that through colonization, a lot of the sustainable practices that native or Indigenous tribes had were basically suppressed or ignored. I think that's important to know. Another example of Indigenous rights and environmental justice is in Australia, and it has to do with the Aboriginal water rights within the region. So for Aboriginal culture, water sources are very important, and I mean, spiritually, it's a very important part of Aboriginal culture, but many livelihoods also depend on water for basic function. And when Aboriginal waters were colonized under Australian law, a lot of the resources were polluted or depleted. For example, the lower Darling River ran dry because irrigators were like stealing and stockpiling water for huge cotton farms. And this has been really harmful for a lot of Aboriginal populations, and they're trying to get, you know, recognition for for their issues, but it's been difficult. But they're going through the legal process right now, trying to amend the Water Act.
So our fourth sort of like region to talk about is Latin America, specifically the Amazon, which is home to sort of a very diverse communities of indigenous folks. And so just to sort of contextualize this, estimates state that anywhere within 15 to 17% of Amazon forests have been destroyed. And we see rates of deforestation within the region really only increasing. And so this has definitely been exacerbated and sort of made like quickened by the privatization of the rainforest by Brazil's president, which has resulted in increased forest fires and loss of resources that sort of indigenous communities have survived off of equitably and sustainably for sort of hundreds of years. And it's this idea again that the resources and the ways and the cultural sort of significances of lands that indigenous folks have been sort of respecting and also just sort of like living like, and I say this word again, but sustainably and equitably on the land for hundreds of years have sort of been erased and pushed aside in favor of sort of a profit first like mentality. And so something that I found really interesting is that this isn't just something that, we talk about and that we say, but like studies have like shown that indigenous communities in the Brazilian Amazon with full ownership rights actually saw a decrease in rates of deforestation within their land. And I'm sure there's a ton of different factors that lead to that, but it's just sort of interesting to see that by decolonizing land and by repatriating it to sort of the communities that were here first or were there first, that there is a way to sort of learn from their methods of living as we move forward.
So we've discussed about environmental justice in North Carolina and within the US, and then we focused on indigenous rights and environmental justice. But we also want to point out that environmental justice is a global issue, and a lot of populations all around the world are disproportionately impacted by climate disasters. So there's a lot of global connections to make. We wanted to highlight two of them, but this is in no way exhaustive. First, we want to discuss the farm workers' rights in India. So in India right now, thousands of farmers are protesting against the Prime Minister's move to deregulate agricultural markets. Opponents say that this policy is just a boon to corporations and repeals key labor and farm price protections, and this could have a devastating impact on the livelihood of farmers. And there's actually, it says 250 million workers, farmers, and their allies across India participated in the largest organized strike in history. And all around the world, farm workers have faced some of the worst environmental injustices, especially during the pandemic. A lot of times they're forced to work for long hours in harsh conditions that are exacerbated by environmental misuse. And a lot of agricultural practices are very harmful for farm workers. And then just to highlight another global connection, there's a lot of environmental justice issues in the Middle East and North Africa. I am personally from the region. I'm from Lebanon and Syria, and I've seen and witnessed a lot of these environmental injustices. First off, air pollution is estimated to kill about 500,000 people annually in the region. So 1 out of every 10 deaths in that region are caused by air pollution, which is staggering. And a lot of conflicts within the Middle East, environmental justice and environmental misuse plays a large role. So, for example, in the war in Yemen, there's rising temperatures, which have exacerbated water shortages. And 19 million people already lack access to clean water and sanitation due to mismanagement and drought. And then within this war, Saudi Arabia has weaponized the water scarcity to target areas for fertile land and destroy water infrastructure. Another example is that in Lebanon, where I'm from, war has really destroyed the energy infrastructure, and due to eco-imperialism and colonization and government corruption, the infrastructure was never fully brought back. And so a lot of families build their own generation. So they literally have a generator for individual homes, and it's very unreliable. Like we'll have blackouts for up to 12 hours a day, and based on your socioeconomic status within the country, you can experience a lot of pollution or, you know, other risks if your generators are not good quality, basically. And for rural regions, water is linked to energy. So there's like this water energy nexus, and the blackouts are very damaging for those communities. And then finally, I wanted to note that oil in the Middle East is a really important case study because, I mean, it's an example of environmental injustice, but it shows how this really important part of like example of imperialism results in environmental injustices, because this uneven distribution of petroleum deposits has created like a disparity of wealth and power within the region. So countries that have oil are able to exert power over countries that don't. And that also has a lot to do with the relationship between the Middle East and developed countries. And I want to note that Saudi Arabia's Aramco, which is the most profitable country in the world, is also the world's largest corporate emitter of greenhouse gases. So this is one example, but it's a very important one. And Aramco sits on the board of US lobbies that fund climate change denial. So that's not fun either. So those are some global connections. And then we want to get into discussion questions, but before we wrap up, I just want to say that this was an introduction to environmental justice, but by no means is it exhaustive. This is a huge topic that so many people are involved in, and there's activism and so much work on this. So we definitely recommend that you do more research on this, and that you hear from, you know, other voices, especially Indigenous voices, Black voices, you know, other people of color who have a lot to say about this topic. Rachita, do you have any concluding thoughts as well?
No, so I think we'll go into breakout rooms now, and we'll do like a short breaker and then discussion questions, and then we can come back and just sort of really quickly debrief before 4:45. I will make those rooms up.
Okay. Also, after the discussion questions, we can answer any general questions that you might have.
Okay, we have a question. What is the best way to educate someone who is too stubborn to listen? Maya, and if anyone else has thoughts, definitely pipe up. I know it's like kind of a large group, but don't feel shy. If you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very hard thing to do. And it's definitely easier said than done. But I think something that I try to do is, I know that like an argument has a kind of assumption, and then based on that assumption, there's this conclusion or like basic principles that this person operates by. And when I listen to someone else's perspective, I always try to kind of operate within their mindset or within their principles and perspective, and from there try to deconstruct the argument. For example, let's say someone is very like economically minded, and they think that being environmentally conscious is going to hurt the economy. I think that a good way to deconstruct that argument is to, you know, operate from their values and their mindset and show that actually implementing green solutions are good for the economy, as opposed to talking about, you know, oh, this is bad for the planet. They're probably not going to care about it. So, you know, operating from things that they care about, you know, from their mindset is important. That's what I try to do. And when someone also has a different perspective, I always try to make sure I completely understand their thoughts and their logic before, you know, butting in with my opinion. And I think from that way, using understanding where their foundation lies is a good way to deconstruct an argument. But it doesn't always work. It really doesn't. So I mean, that's why we kind of live in different realities at this point in this country. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with that. But I think there, to some extent, especially if it's within like a group or like a space, sorry, where they are sort of actively causing harm, or like there is something, you know, that is not able to be like changed, and there is sort of a fundamental difference in mindset. I think that it is okay to say that, you know, this group or the space is for certain folks only, and this is more so, less so like large level understandings of like climate justice, and more so like individual spaces on like campuses or anything like that. It's like okay to say that this is a space dedicated to X, Y, and Z. These are our sort of values. These are our morals, whatever you want to call them. We're not willing to sort of give up or sacrifice any of those just to sort of be sort of a quote unquote like welcoming space, and that's okay too. I think to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you know, I'm down to, for example, you know, talk about the impacts of climate change in the economy. But if someone says, I don't care about this population of people, or, you know, tries to something like that, like there's just like certain, I do think that there are certain perspectives and certain points that don't deserve to have the space. It's not that often, but I think that there's a certain amount of hate and bigotry that needs to be, I just don't put the effort to try to argue that, honestly. I'm just one person, but, you know, I think that's important to know. Thank you, Rachida. That's a really important point.
Okay, if there aren't any other thoughts, then thank you all for coming. This was a really great space. All the discussions that I popped into were really great. Yeah. If you have any questions, me and my put our emails into the chat. So yeah, definitely feel free to reach out.